about this week. You know, there's different kinds of riots. If the Habs bring home the Stanley Cup, you know there's going to be a riot. I mean, the thing is, though, it's not going to be a dangerous riot, so to speak. There's going to be looting. There's going to be windows front smashed. There's going to be people climbing on police cars, bouncing up and down. And the only real injuries, though, probably is somebody falls off and bunks their head or something. That's one kind of riot. But there's other kinds of riots that are far, far more serious. For instance, back in 1965, the city of Watts in the suburb of Los Angeles went through a 6-day riot. 34 people were killed, 1,000 buildings were destroyed, $40 million of property damage was done, over 1,000 injuries, and 4,000 arrests. It was the single most deadly riot in U.S. history. You know, I think about prison riots. They can be extremely dangerous too. Back in the early 80s, there was a riot at the state prison in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And they wrote a book about it called The Hate Factory, talking about how the prison itself was a pressure cooker for hatred. That the guards hated the inmates hated the guards. There was a lot of tension, a lot of hatred, and boom, it all exploded one night, and they took over the prison. They brutalized the guards. They brutalized one another. I had a friend who was on the SWAT team who went in to take back the prison, and he said every time they turned the corner, they would throw up. They would see something so grotesque and so inhuman that they would throw up. But there was one officer who must have been a pretty good guy, because the inmates took him and they hid him in a locker to protect him throughout the whole riot, throughout everything that happened. And then when they took over the prison, he was able to come out safe and sound, not a scratch on him. And it kind of reminds me of where we are today. We have a very, very dangerous riot going on here in Ephesus, and look how God protects Paul. He protects Paul really in 3 ways. He protects him, first of all, by the efforts of others. So turn with me in your Bibles to Acts chapter 19, verses 30 to 41. Acts chapter 19, verses 30 to 41. We're going to see here in these first 3 verses, 30 to 32, that the friends of Paul were focused, while the mob, on the other hand, was unfocused. Look how focused they are here in verse 30. It says in verse 30 that when Paul wanted to go into the people, the disciples would not allow him. So the disciples said, no, you're not going in there. Why would he go in there in the first place? It would be very dangerous for him to do that. But a couple of things were probably on Paul's mind. He wanted to defend the gospel. He wanted to have a chance to preach the gospel. This would have been a crowd of maybe 25,000 people that could have heard the gospel for the first time. So he saw that as an opportunity for that. But he also probably saw it as an opportunity to defend the Gaius and Aristarchus, who had been arrested and hustled into the theater there. So he's probably, that could have been on his mind, although it was a very dangerous situation. But his disciples were after him to protect him. And if you look at chapter 21, verse 12 and 13, you'll see the same spirit. Acts 21, 12 and 13. It says, now when they heard these things, both we and those that from that place pleaded with him not to go to Jerusalem. Then Paul said, what do you mean by weeping and breaking my heart? For I'm ready not only to be bound, but also to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Because one of the prophets, it says, if you go to Jerusalem, you're going to be bound up in chains. So they were always looking out for Paul. They were always caring about Paul. So the friends there were very focused. And it kind of got me to thinking, you know, where else in the Bible do we see this kind of protection? And, you know, when we get in jam, we get in danger where we want the Lord to deliver us. And I think a lot of the times we kind of get ahead of God and think of how it should happen. The Lord will probably do this, or the Lord will probably do that. And I'm looking for him to do something that I can understand. But a lot of times it's not understood. So let's take a look at some things here, some ways that God has protected people in the past. In Daniel, we have nothing, eh? Okay, don't worry about it. In Daniel chapter 6:22, we know what happens to Daniel 6. Daniel is thrown into the lion's den because he broke the king's law by praying to somebody other than the king. Daniel 6:22 says, "My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you." So Daniel was saved by an angel. An angel comes down and delivers him from the lions. Paul was saved also in Acts 22, verse 26. When the centurion heard that, he went and told the commander, saying, "Take care what you do, for this man is a Roman." Paul was about to be scourged, and he told the centurion standing by him, "Is it lawful for you to beat an uncondemned Roman citizen?" And of course it was not. And he brought that to the attention of the commander. The commander cut him loose. So he was delivered from that scourging by a centurion. And in Jeremiah 38, verse 9, Jeremiah is about to be thrown, he's actually thrown into a well. Falls down to the bottom, there's no water in the well, but it's, it's several feet of mud, and he starts sinking into the mud. And a eunuch comes up to the king, and he says, "My lord the king," in verse 9, "these men have done evil and all that they have done to Jeremiah the prophet, whom they have cast into the dungeon, and he's likely to die from hunger in the place where he is, for there is no more bread in the city." So the king says, "Okay, go get 30 men, get some rags, put them under his armpits, throw a rope down, and pull him out of there." So God he's not bound. He's not desperate for ways to deliver us. He can deliver us in any way that he wants. So we see that in these three instances. So the friends are focused, and in verse 31, the officials are focused. Verse 31, it says this, "Then some of the officials of Asia, who were his friends, sent to him pleading that he would not venture into the theater." Now, these are officials, they were called Asiarchs. Asiarchs, they were in charge of the province, and they were very high up in the government, and they would be charged with taking care of the temple, taking care of the theater, and all of that kind of stuff. And every time they would have a big celebration, a big feast for Diana, their goddess, they would be the ones who would get that thing going, organize it, and even pay for it out of their own pocket. So they were very wealthy men. This was a position that you sought eagerly because it was a very prestigious position. So Paul could count among his friends these Asiarchs, these officials of the city. So it says here in verse 31, it says that some of the officials of Asia who were his friends sent to him pleading that he would not venture into the theater. So Paul's disciples and the officials that were his friends, they were focused. They wanted to deliver Paul from any possible danger. But on the contrast, look how unfocused the mob is. In verse 32, it says, "Some of them therefore cried one thing, and some another, for the assembly was confused, and most of them did not know why they had come together." Now, you can see a little bit of Luke's sarcasm here as he calls them the assembly, which they were anything but an assembly. They were not an organized, lawful assembly. They were a mob. They were a mob. They were filled with disharmony. They were filled with confusion. They were filled with ignorance. They didn't even know why that they had come there. All they knew was, here's some excitement. Let's go find out what's going on. They had a curiosity situation. They wanted to go find out what was everybody upset about. Okay, if God hadn't used the disciples and the officials, Paul would probably have been killed. So God protects Paul by the efforts of others. He also protects Paul by distracting the mob in verses 33 and 34. Verse 33, we introduce Alexander. Verse 33 says this, "And they drew Alexander out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward, and Alexander motioned with his hand and wanted to make his defense to the people." So Alexander is chosen, he's put forward. Okay? The next verse says this. "But when they found out that he was a Jew, all with one voice cried out for about 2 hours, 'Great is Diana of the Ephesians.'" Now, what is prompting Alexander? Who is Alexander? We don't really know who he is. We don't have any information on who Alexander is, but they choose him. He was probably a very good speaker. So the Jews chose him because of that, and they put him forward. Why did they put him forward? He doesn't get a chance to speak because as soon as they realize he's a Jew, probably could tell by the way he was dressed that he was a Jew, that they go crazy. And for 2 solid hours, they're hollering out, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." Now, what's Alexander's interest in all of this? I'll tell you what it was. He doesn't want to be identified with Paul. He doesn't want to be identified with the Christians. He wants the Jews to be left alone, not to be in any way associated with this movement involving Paul. See, they had a problem. The Roman government had a problem with the Jewish people because they considered them to be instigators, always starting riots, always having problems, always causing difficulties for the Roman government. So he wants to make sure that they're not associated with Paul, but he doesn't get a chance. He doesn't get a chance because as soon as they see that he's a Jew, they start yelling out, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." So why are they doing that? Because they know that Jews are monotheists. They only believe in one God, and they don't believe in Diana. So there is kind of an insult. It's kind of a thing to put him down and to shut him up. So they introduce Alexander, and then they reject Alexander because he's a Jew and he's a monotheist. So putting Alexander forward took the focus off Paul long enough for God to use another avenue of deliverance. He shifts their focus. They're not focused on Paul and Gaius and Aristarchus anymore. They can't find Paul. They don't know where Paul is. As I said last week, Paul was probably being hidden by Aquila and Priscilla. And because Paul later on talks about how they risked their necks to save him. So they can't find Paul. They got Aristarchus and Gaius here, and they're ready to do damage to them, but they get just distracted by this Jew, Alexander. So putting Alexander forward took the focus off Paul long enough for God to use another avenue of deliverance. And that brings to God's third method of protection, showing Paul's innocence. So in verse 35, we see this. "And when the city clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, 'Men of Ephesus,' and then he begins to make an appeal to them." Now, who is this city clerk? The city clerk has really got a lot more prestige than the name implies. He's not a low-level functionary in the government. The city clerk was really more like the chief executive officer of the city. A lot of prestige, a lot of power, a lot of authority. So when he gets up, the people get quieted down because they want to hear what he has to say. So he makes an appeal here. He appeals in verse 35 to their religious affections, which is really kind of neat. Because if you remember what Demetrius, last week we looked at Demetrius. Demetrius comes forward as a silversmith, and he whips the crowd into a frenzy, and he tells them, "We got to do something because these guys are blaspheming our great goddess Diana. They're going to ruin our trade as making idols to worship." And the city clerk does the exact same thing, but he uses it in the opposite direction to great effect. Look what he says here in verse 35. He says, "When the city clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, 'Men of Ephesus, what man is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple guardian of the great goddess Diana, and of his image which fell from Zeus?'" So he's appealing here to their religious affections. What are you guys worried about? Everybody knows. Everybody in the world knows that Ephesus is the temple guardian of the great goddess of Diana. And look how he gets this point made here, whose image fell down from heaven, fell down from Zeus. Which is neat because Demetrius had said the opposite. Demetrius had accused Paul of saying that they are not gods that are made with men's hands. So he said, well, maybe that's right. We didn't make this image. This image fell down from heaven. It was probably a meteorite, and they looked at the meteorite, and it looked like the figure of a woman with a whole lot of breasts. So that was they came up with the idea that this was sent down from Zeus for them to worship, to be their goddess of fertility and all of that kind of stuff. So he's using the same argument that Demetrius is using, only in a different way. He's saying, yes, we're the temple keepers of Diana, but nobody's going to bother us. Nobody can beat the truth. You know that this is an established fact, that we have the real deal here. Then he appeals to their sense of order in verse 36. Verse 36 says this, "Therefore, since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rashly." Be careful. He's appealing to their sense of order. If you come in here and you start acting crazy and you go nuts, it's not going to end well. So calm down, take a deep breath, breathe through your nose, and everything's going to be fine. Then he appeals to their sense of justice in verse 37. He says, "For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of your goddess." So what is he doing here? He's establishing the innocence of Gaius and Aristarchus, and by extension, the Apostle Paul himself. These guys are not temple robbers. They haven't done anything wrong physically. They haven't done anything wrong verbally. They have not blasphemed our great goddess Diana. So what are you getting so exercised about? I'm appealing to your sense of justice. You're wronging these men. Now this is highly significant because Paul not only had the officials of the city as his friends, these Asiarchs, but he had a reputation for not upsetting the apple cart. He did not unduly insult the pagan gods of other countries. He didn't do that in Athens. He's not doing it in Ephesus. He was able to make his point without waving a red flag in front of the bull and working up a lot of unnecessary anger. There was a missionary in the Philippines who drove around town with a speaker mounted on top of his car, and he was criticizing the Catholic Church. That's not smart. It's not necessary. You don't have to tear down the Catholic Church. You do need to preach the truth, but you can preach the truth without tearing down other people's gods or whatever. And this is what Paul did. Paul had a reputation for speaking the truth, talking about Jesus, but not talking down any other particular deities. So that I found that very significant. But in keeping with this idea of appealing to their sense of justice, Paul had official approval now. The city clerk has said that Paul is okay. Paul's not a lawbreaker. He's not a temple robber. He's not a blasphemer, and neither are any of his friends.